My involvement came both with aluminum and steel under the 232 tariff, as well as the 301 tariff that applied to a lot of general goods, including lighting and electrical products, which greatly impacted a business that I owned at that time. That wasn't the start of tariffs. Tariffs already existed at that point. That was just the start of larger impositions of larger tariffs on goods coming in from primarily China at the time. So, those 301 tariffs, the 232 tariffs, they get controlled by something called HTS codes. And every product in the world is assigned by the government an HTS code. And HTS codes then have tariffs assigned to them. And that determines the amount of tariff that an importer needs to pay on those goods as they cross the border and through customs.
Who decides which HTS codes are picked or penalties?
Yeah, so that's all through the government, primarily through the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, which is all part of the executive branch of the government. Congress has nothing to do with the amount of tariffs that are imposed on goods. That is all handled through the powers of the executive branch and the USTR under the executive branch.
Can I ask, is the USTR a guy or is it actually a department? I mean, U.S. Trade Representative, it sounds like there's a person assigned to that, which is an incredibly powerful person if that's
There's someone assigned to be the head of it. And they have representatives from a lot of organizations. And when the 301 tariffs and the 232 tariffs were being proposed, I actually went to Capitol Hill along with hundreds of other people to testify against the tariffs in front of the USTR and representatives of a number of organizations, including the Small Business Administration, and to explain why tariffs weren't a good thing and why they were only a tax on small business.
I want to come back. So we've got Legislative Action Day coming up, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. But I know you've already been up there and you're talking to Congress. And so we'll talk about whether you feel that's a worthy endeavor. But you just said a mouthful. I think most people think Congress is in charge of tariffs. It's an executive branch decision, isn't it?
It is. Right down to the point that before the current president was elected, I was having conversations with Senator Rand Paul's office in Kentucky because he's a free trade person, very much opposed to tariffs. One of the ideas we floated to him was the idea that Congress controls taxes while it has no control over tariffs. And if we have to pay tariffs, why not push small business exemptions and tax relief to small businesses to apply against tariffs that they're paying? And he was very much interested in this until he decided to take a better chairmanship and move on from the Small Business Administration and decided not to lock horns with the current president.
You know what? Leave it to a smart attorney to figure out the language part of it. I've learned that with a lot of the contracts that we sign, and in particular, a lot of the union contracts we sign. If something in a union negotiation is introduced to a contract, once it's in, I was told, if you don't like it later, you're probably not going to get it removed. You have to introduce new language that's going to minimize or neutralize the impact of that thing you don't like. So to your point, executive branch picks the tariff. But you're saying Congress can introduce tax law that may minimize the impact of that. And can they do that without the executive branch crying foul? Can they actually have an impact on neutralizing the impact of those tariffs by exemptions, as an example?
So they could pass legislation that would give tax relief to small business. The president would have the ability to veto that, and then Congress could override the veto, but that requires a 2/3 vote of Congress.
Well, what's your?
I'm curious.
Sorry,
I'm curious, Rob. In that same scenario, let me give the first scenario first. So, if there's someone that's importing, they're now paying the tariff. The people that are not importing and are producing in the United States, don't they end up just raising their prices because that's what the markets become typically in a tariff situation? Is that not always, but isn't that likely what happens?
Well, I think there's a couple of things at play. First of all, we don't have the capacity in this country to manufacture everything that we need to make. including components needed to manufacture things. So typically something being made here has to be important.
Right.
For example, in my world, you're not going to find all the LED chips that you need in this country. And the great center for that is both Taiwan and China. So you're going to import at least that component into this country. So at least a portion of your product is going to be subject to a tariff, which is going to lead to higher prices.
Right.
Great point.
But even in the case of, like, let's say steel, there's someone manufacturing steel in the US using US steel, and now all of a sudden it's more expensive to get steel from China. Aren't the US steel companies just going to raise their price to what it is in China because that's what the market's bearing essentially?
Or slightly below it, I think.
Just
Why not?
slightly below it.
Right. Right. Why not take advantage of the opportunity to make hay when you can?
So is that not what would happen in the small business case that you just mentioned, where there's an exemption for small businesses on some of these taxations for imports, but they go ahead and keep their prices high and they're just getting the tax cut?
Well, it's also a matter of how companies choose to apply tariffs to their customers. You know, you can do it through increasing the price of your goods, or as my former company did under my direction, we did a separate line item on invoices for tariffs. And what we said was that if you're buying goods from us that are subject to tariffs, you'll see a line item for tariffs on the invoice.
Yeah.
Our naive hope, and I say naive hope now, was that tariffs would get decreased or go away someday, and we would take the tariff away, and we'd have a huge market advantage over our competitors who had already increased their prices. And once someone increases the price, they don't roll them back too often.
Well, and I
Yeah,
love,
well-
the other thing is, I don't know that it avoids the stigma, but everybody, can scream foul when pricing's going up. I love that you were calling out, line iteming literally separately what that cost was. And for me, and I'm also a customer of Rob's, there's no hard feelings. I understand that you have to pass that cost along. You're calling out what it is. I can read what it is. And to your point, should it change, go lower or go away, I have an expectation of that line item getting lower or going away. And there's no bundled in. And then I find myself wondering, did they really, lower taxes or lower prices when they
It
could?
was an attempt at transparency. It was certainly a marketing strategy as well.
Yeah.
I won't deny that. And, trying to also, as you just pointed out, Chris, to educate the customer as to what's the cost of the product and where is the government goose.
Well,
I'm-
we're a
I'm
long ways away from that one item being now it's, I don't know how you separate given all the things that tariff policies now
Yeah.
touching.
I'm curious from the industry experts here. Whenever there's constraints in any form, people get creative. And I'm curious what you think some of the creative things might happen inside of the industry. Like, are people going to go back to using wood for some of these displays because of some of the issues?
That's a great
So
conversation.
Chris and I had
We
this-
just had this
yeah.
conversation. Yeah, no, Rod,
Yeah.
we were talking about it at one point because aluminum is such a prevalent component in our industry when everything used to be traditionally wood built. And so, but there was a push for lighter weight because so many other costs on the show floor are related to the weight of your stuff. Khalil, you and I have talked about that in other episodes.
Yeah.
So what just happened with lumber out of Canada, right? It's now 50% tariff on that because it very well could have been that this played out that a lot of traditional custom builders and wood shops started booming as they go back to making things with traditional lumber. And I don't know if anybody at the government level thought of that, but they've now neutralized that as an option to sort of get around that. But I don't know, Rob, how do you view it?
I totally agree with that. And I wonder where the next creative entrepreneur will be. It's not something I want to dive into, but potentially, can you extrude heavy duty plastic that can hold the strength of
Structural,
aluminum
yeah.
and create building sticks essentially out of extruded plastic, which can be done domestically? And I say plastic, it could be a variety of materials, some glass, fiber mix potentially, that can withstand the weights and structural integrity of what's needed to build exhibit systems.